Hello, and welcome to People of the Pod, brought to you by American Jewish Committee. Each week, we take you beyond the headlines to help you understand what they all mean for America, Israel, and the Jewish people. I'm your host, Manya Brachear Pashman. Nearly 60 years ago, the Roman Catholic Church issued a declaration called Nostra Aetate, a groundbreaking document that, among other things, aimed to heal the Church's strained relationship with the Jewish community at large. But over the past year, since the start of the Israel-Hamas war, there have been some tense moments. A call from Pope Francis to investigate whether Israel is committing genocide, a photograph of the Pope before a nativity scene featuring a keffiyeh. Now AJC and the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops have unveiled Translate Hate, the Catholic edition, the glossary of anti-Semitic terms, tropes, and memes, originally published in 2019, also features Catholic commentaries to explain why the Church has made combating anti-Semitism a priority. Here to talk about this partnership is Bishop Joseph Bambera, chairman of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops Committee on Ecumenical and Interreligious Affairs. Bishop, welcome.
Thank you for the honor of being with you today.
Bishop Bambera, please walk us through the Catholic edition of Translate Hate and how the Catholic Church became involved in this initiative together with the Jewish community.
I think the best way to walk us through the Translate Hate Catholic edition is to first take us back to 1965. There was this really milestone declaration, Nostra Aetate, that I think many of us would be familiar with. And that really speaks about our relationship as it stands today, a relationship that I would say tragically prior to the Second Vatican Council was not what it should have been. And on the heels of the Council, for almost 60 years, an anniversary that we'll celebrate next year, we have grown together in mutual respect and understanding. That particular declaration, Nostra Aetate, speaks very, very clearly about the fact that Catholics and Jews really share a common patrimony. We Catholics, our roots are in Judaism. Jesus was Jewish, his family was, and so many members of the early church were as well. And we recognize and affirm in that document the fact that the Jewish people were the first to hear the word of God and are a part of a covenant relationship that certainly has not been in any way broken, but has been maintained, and something that we affirm and that we teach in that document, a very important thing from my perspective. And as well, the document reminds all those who would be familiar with it, and certainly who should be if they are not, of the importance of us coming to a deeper sense of mutual respect and understanding, of decrying any sense of hatred, persecution, or anti-Semitic efforts on the part of individuals that really have been such a burden to the Jewish people. So that particular document really laid the groundwork for the very simple fact that I am here today and a part of this initiative. But to fast forward a bit, the reality of anti-Semitism, as you know better than I, it has hardly diminished and sadly has intensified in recent years, and well before October 7th of 2023. So much so that the bishops of the United States, many of them, brought to the attention of the committee that I chair, the Bishops' Committee for Ecumenism and Interreligious Affairs, have brought to our attention the fact that we need to begin to do something in a more concrete way to walk more intimately and closely and lovingly with our Jewish brothers and sisters, and to address the reality of anti-Semitism in very real and concrete manner. And so in 2022, this committee that I just referenced, they issued a document that they shared with all of the bishops. It's called The Fruits of Dialogues, Catholics Confronting Anti-Semitism. And in many respects, I would say that that particular document was the impetus for this initiative that we are a part of today, the Translate Hate Catholic edition. hopefully it's been the impetus for other efforts on the part of many bishops in their own particular dioceses and archdioceses to work with their Jewish partners to help to eradicate this, or certainly to address it in a way that is hope-filled. So this document has been in the works now for quite a while, particularly with the leadership of the Bishops' Committee and the American Jewish Committee as well. What you will find is building upon the anti-Semitic themes and tropes that were placed in the document when the American Jewish Committee put it together. We have provided commentary on a number of them from a Catholic perspective, okay? So if you look at the notion of deicide, the commentary that we provide there offers very, very clear Catholic theological teaching on the fact that that whole reality is certainly not something we would ever intend to insinuate today is the responsibility of all of the Jewish people. In the midst of these commentaries, we offer current theological teaching. We offer teaching on human dignity, which is so much a part of our tradition and our hope and prayer for humankind. And we acknowledge as well in some of those commentaries the fact that, some members of the church throughout history have been insensitive and inappropriately offered, and perhaps even negligently offered, words and actions that led to anti-Semitic efforts, sadly, on the part of so many.
So what is the expectation? This document is going out. How are you expecting or wanting parishes and pastors to implement it?
Given the fact that the document that the Bishops' Committee came out with in 2022 was really at the initiative of many bishops in the United States, I would like to believe and think that the vast majority of our bishops will embrace this and use it in whatever way speaks to the situation within their own territory, their own region, relative to the Jewish community there. So, for example, once this is officially promulgated today, later on in the day, we will be releasing from the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops on our Bishops Only website, we will be releasing a letter from me as the chair of this committee and the document. And that will be followed up with a hard copy that will be sent to every bishop in the near future, following the online version that they'll receive today. We anticipate that this will be used by other committees that might have some relationship to the work that our committee does, and the hope that they would use them. We will be disseminating it to ecumenical officers who are appointed in every one of our dioceses to do the work of ecumenism and interreligious affairs.
You mentioned Nostra Aetate in 1965. You were just a child then. You and I should also mention AJC played a leading role in those conversations as well with Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. You were ordained 20 years later, and I'm just curious if this major turning point in Catholic-Jewish relations, did it come up in your theology training? Or 20 years later, was it just accepted as the norm?
I will be frank with you. The term that you used in asking the question was, did it come up? Yes, it did. It did. But given the scope of issues that would be necessary to prepare a man for ministry in the church as a priest in the seminary, everything rose to the level of being absolutely vital to our preparation. So this was, but it took its place in a whole line of other things that were just as vital. So maybe the best way to answer your question was, a great deal of the teaching of the Second Vatican Council was integrated into many of the theology courses that I would have taken. And the same would go for something like Nostra Aetate. I was certainly familiar with it. It was certainly something that was communicated as a very significant teaching, a milestone moment in our church, a clear refocusing of our relationship with the Jewish community. Prior to that, there were no relationships officially. So it was put before us as something that was vital to consider, but I would not be honest in wanting to suggest that in some way it was a major focus. It was one of many.
I do want to fast forward and talk about today. Of course, Catholic-Jewish relations are quite complicated now, especially given the Israel-Hamas war. I imagine educating, inspiring your flock on the moral complexities of that war while also rallying the faithful to combat the rise of antisemitism against Israel and the Jewish diaspora at large is very complicated. And there have been some tense moments recently. A letter from Pope Francis 1 year after the October 7th terror attacks included a couple kind of eerily iconic phrases from John 8:44, a verse that's long been understood as a kind of a fundamental eternal indictment of the entire Jewish people. It was even cited by the Pittsburgh synagogue shooter. A lot of Jews are irate that the Pope has called for an investigation into whether Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. And most recently, some people were upset that the Nativity scene at the Vatican featured a baby Jesus resting in a manger, draped with a keffiyeh, a Palestinian national symbol. And I know that has since been removed from that scene. But how do you talk about all of these moments with your Jewish friends like the Hollanders, when they arise?
First of all, the concern that you share in that question, maybe the hurt or the confusion that some of these things have caused, it's rather palpable. I spoke about it just coming into the studio today with Rabbi Marans. I would first say that the very fact that in this exchange that we are having here today, on a day that is a real positive step, I believe, in Catholic-Jewish relations with the promulgation of Translate Hate, a Catholic edition, I would say it's a testimony to the relationship that we have developed. And I want to thank you for that. I want to thank you for the question. They're not easy questions to address, but they are of great concern to you and so many others. And you, on behalf of your people, have a responsibility to ask me that question. And I need to say to you that my presence here today is meant to speak a word of encouragement regarding our relationship. It is one that is deeply valued. I treasure it. I'm grateful for it. I am honored to be here today. Now, with that, let me speak a little bit more directly to the question and how these types of things are addressed. You know, I look at the work that I have done in ecumenism and interreligious affairs, and I've been privileged to be chairman of this committee for a term now for 3 years. I was previously, back in 2017, elected chairman of this very same committee. So I've been at the helm of it twice now. And I've learned so much from Christian partners, so much from our Jewish partners. One of the things that I have learned in the midst of the work that I have done with ecumenism is that I can't create a false sense of unity and harmony. For us to journey together in a positive way, I need to hear what you have to say, and I need to receive it. And I can't say something that is contrary to where my church is, okay? Now, another dimension of the dialogue work that I have learned relates to listening. How do we listen to what we hear about this relationship? What are we hearing when we read something about Pope Francis? How is that speaking to our hearts? What is it saying to this relationship? I hear from you a hurt. I hear from you confusion. I said that a moment ago. For me, and perhaps this is the best thing that I can say, and I would say it across all three areas or topics that you raised in your question, I would say this much. I can't speak for Pope Francis, but what I can do is reflect to you what I hear from him and what I have heard from him throughout his 11 years as Pope. I have heard from him very, very early on, and you're all familiar with this quote that he offered to a Jewish interreligious organization way back, I think in 2013 or 14, shortly after he was elected Pope, that a true Christian cannot be an anti-Semite. That's something that I would affirm. And that's something that I have never heard him go back on. I have heard him embrace, prior to his election, a deep commitment to the documents of Vatican Council, Vatican II, and particularly a deep commitment to the tenets of Nostra Aetate. The other thing that I've heard from Pope Francis, and perhaps this speaks to some of the struggle that you raise, that in the face of terrorism and war and the loss of innocent lives, of Jewish lives that were lost in 2023, and of countless other lives that are lost throughout our world in the midst of war, I hear him speak over and over again about human dignity, the value of life, and the reason for why we treasure life. And that's rooted in a common scripture that we both cherish. In the first book of the Torah, Genesis, the first chapter, in the image of God, man was created, in the image and likeness of God. I think that that speaks for me to this moment. It does not take away, and I would not imagine that for a moment, some of the struggle that you experience. But that's what I hear when I look at his papacy. I also look at some more personal dimensions of it, and I know that his experience as the Archbishop of Buenos Aires was an experience that found him deeply connected to the Jewish community, particularly to a close friend of his, whom I've been privileged to meet, Rabbi Abram Skorka. So I share these things with you in response to your observation. And by the same token, I would say to you that we have miles to go before we achieve the end for which we are about here today.
In this moment, Bishop, do you believe that Translate Hate, specifically this New Catholic edition, has particular value in this moment that we talked about where the relationship can get complicated?
I think in any moment in time when there is suffering because of hatred, because of an anti-Semitic perspective that so many people so horrifically bring to life, I think this particular initiative is vital. And I think today, more than ever, we have recognized it in our church, the sufferings of our Jewish brothers and sisters. We have recognized it globally. We have recognized it in our country. And we experience it in my community, Scranton, a relatively, small city of about 100,000 people. It's sadly everywhere. I believe this moment is a bit of a clarion call for all of us to walk a little bit more authentically and closely with our Jewish brothers and sisters. It's one thing to have issued a document 60 years ago. You can forget the intensity and the significance that that document was and meant 60 years ago, 50 years ago, maybe even 40 years ago. But as time goes on and generations pass, we sometimes need to refocus our attention, don't we? And we need to recognize the fact that as our society becomes more secularized, we can't possibly circle the wagons to just preserve what we have. Every one of our congregations, many of yours and many of mine, are diminishing in terms of numbers since the pandemic, but also before that as well. And I think sadly what you see in many congregations is this sense of trying to preserve what one has and therefore excluding others. I certainly don't necessarily mean from being in a church or a synagogue or temple, but I mean excluding from life by one's attitudes and one's actions and one's words. And I think we are at this moment really at risk of losing a sense of what we learn and how we grow from dialogue. I'm here to tell you today that I am so much richer personally because of this opportunity that I have been given to be a part of this initiative, frankly, to even prepare for today. It's just been a wonderful experience for me that has really re-energized me in this wonderful mission. but it's also reminded me of how much people who are involved in faith traditions in a leadership position can be somewhat academically connected to something. It's got to be translated to the heart. And I hope that that's what happens here.
I mentioned that you were just a child when Nostra Aetate came about. Can you tell us a little bit about your upbringing and when you heard the calling to seek ordination and become a priest?
I grew up in a Catholic family. I didn't have a lot of Jewish friends. There weren't a lot of Jewish people living in our community, although I did develop friends as I went off to college. When I got the call to become a priest, I was actually at the University of Pittsburgh with every intention of becoming a dentist. It was kind of the family business. And I got involved in an ecumenical Christian campus ministry program. But, it was just an experience that really called me to develop a deeper sense of authenticity, I think, in my faith journey. And so that's what ultimately prompted me to go into the seminary and become a priest.
Did you grow up in Pittsburgh?
I grew up in Scranton, where I serve as bishop, which is very unusual. My mom, who at 97 still lives nearby. I've spent my entire ministry in the Diocese of Scranton, and 15 years ago was appointed bishop.
That is indeed rare. So you get to see the parish in which you grew up.
I do. And I've journeyed with this community. There's pluses and minuses to something like that, Sometimes people say, what's the best thing about being bishop in your home diocese? I say, you know people and they know you. And what's the most challenging thing? You know people and they know you.
Well, Bishop, thank you so much for sharing what the Church is teaching now and how it's collaborating with AJC to build bridges and educate your flock. Thank you so much, and thank you for joining us.
It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you for listening. This episode is brought to you by AJC. Our producer is Atara Lakritz. Our sound engineer is TK Broderick. You can subscribe to People of the Pod on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Google Podcasts, or learn more at ajc.org/peopleofthepod. The views and opinions of our guests don't necessarily reflect the positions of AJC. We'd love to hear your views and opinions or your questions. You can reach us at peopleofthepod@ajc.org. If you've enjoyed this episode, please be sure to tell your friends, tag us on social media with #peopleofthepod, and hop on to Apple Podcasts to rate us and write a review to help more listeners find us. Tune in next week for another episode of People of the Pod.